This is Dr. Mark Schneider. I'm here with Dr. Joan Mazur, and we are super excited to have expert gamer and coach Michael Takahashi. Michael is the coach of Supernova. They play League of Legends, and they are just an incredible team. Um, I believe Michael is like in the top 1% as far as gamer, and he is world renowned and plays with other teammates from all over the world. Michael, welcome.
Hello, how's it going?
It's going really good. So we want to first talk about your personal game use and experience. What got you into video games?
I don't really know when I personally got invested into video games. I know that my babysitter when I was like 2 or 3 years old would play Super Mario on the NES, like when he was taking care of my sister and I. So I would just watch that happen, and sometimes he would let me play, and that's pretty much like I think what started it all. I have no idea after that.
So what was the first video game that you remember playing?
Probably Pong or Super Mario. I actually don't remember, but one of those two.
That was also on the NES?
Um, Atari? I want to say. I have no idea. Again, this is forever ago, and I don't remember much when I was that old.
Well, full disclosure, Michael's a family member, and I think I saw that NES in our basement. I'm positive I did.
Yes.
Uh, okay, so what was the first MMOG game you played?
Probably RuneScape, which is a little different from League just because it's not inherently competitive. Um, it's just kind of like a time sink, honestly. Like, you just kind of spend time, get in-game resources and currencies, make your character stronger, repeat the cycle. It's like a series of gratification things that make that enjoying, but very different from what I'm doing nowadays.
Well, that's interesting because as part of gamification, gratification is an important part. So would it level up over time?
Yeah, pretty much. Spend time, get resources, make your character stronger, repeat cycle. That's pretty much it.
Sounds good. Tell us tell us about League of Legends.
League
From
of
a novice, yeah, speaking to people who are novices.
Yeah, so the best way I can describe it is a strategy game. Technically, it's defined as a MOBA, which stands for Multiplayer Online Battle Arena, which just means that after every game, all of your character's strengths reset to a base value. So if you start here and during the game you get stronger and stronger and stronger, you eventually win. None of that carries over to the next game. It all gets reset to zero at the baseline level. So it's basically 5 players versus a team of other 5 players competing against each other to essentially destroy the other team's structures. And the last structure that's standing at the very end, if that blows up, you lose. So basically the only goal of the game is to destroy that one structure, but there's a lot of ways of going about it. And the game has depth at kind of a macro level and a micro level as well. The macro level would be kind of how all the 5 players together interact with each other, and the micro level being the individual characters themselves and how they're controlled and moved. So that would be one player controlling one character and how they do actions only concerning themselves. So there's a lot of depth in both of those aspects, and I think that's what makes it kind of interesting. The way that I can think about it is drawing a lot of parallels to chess. So each person would control a character. So say that you could be a knight or a bishop or a rook. In the early game of chess, the knight is more powerful because it can move over pieces. It has more movement options. And later game, it falls off into being less useful than, say, a knight or a rook or a bishop that can move longer distances than the knight at the end of the game when the board's kind of more cleared up. So characters in the game also kind of have that same parallel where some might be inherently better at others and doing other roles and other things. So each person kind of serves as a different piece in this game of like chess almost.
What is the average age of the player?
Anywhere from 16 to about 30, at least at the professional level. in the people that I coach usually are of the older variety, like late 20s, early 30s, just because I think those are the people that have the money to afford private coaching and one-on-one. But I know that a lot of players are definitely younger than that. There's like probably anywhere from 14 to 15 year olds to 21 year olds is the main player base of like the actual game itself. So probably, yeah, like early 20s, I would say, late teens.
So what do you think of League of Legends and other games like that being a spectator sport? Like, I know that people can watch it on Twitch.
Initially, I didn't really think of it being a spectator sport per se. It was definitely fun to spectate, but I wouldn't go so far as to call it a sport. In later times, my opinion of that has kind of changed just because of the way that it's interesting for other people to watch, right? Like, you watch a game of baseball or football or whatever just because you yourself cannot do that at the highest level. It's like why watching the Olympics is interesting even if you have no investment whatsoever in the sport. Like watching curling at the highest level for some reason is like deeply interesting to me, even though you would think that would be a super boring sport, because I know I'd look at that and I say that looks really hard, like I can't do that. I think the biggest difference between games as a spectator sport and a sport itself is that a sport is physically limiting. Like your body determines that you can't jump 9 feet in the air and stop, a basketball from flying over your head. If someone were to do that, that looks hard to you because that's a set of rules and systems that you're familiar with, like the law of gravity. Like we're all familiar with that. We deal with it every single day. League of Legends has its own kind of boundaries that it gets set, and anyone is capable of doing the same things within the game. So we're all kind of put at like an equal playing field, and that's what kind of makes it so interesting in that, me being taller than someone else doesn't inherently give me an advantage. There's nothing that gives me an advantage besides, how hard I work at it, my reflexes, that kind of thing. So it kind of levels the playing field. But on the flip side, it's harder to appreciate because you don't understand how difficult something is unless you've also played the game and tried to do it yourself. If you haven't played it, you can't understand what is challenging and why it is challenging. So I think that the level of appreciation to be able to call it a sport would have to involve people trying the game and realizing, hey, that's pretty hard to do. And you can appreciate when someone does that. I think that's the level of enjoyment we get from watching sports. And the similar kind of thing comes from watching a esport almost.
Well, just like people watching sports, there's been some talk about actually having video games in the Olympics. I think there's been some serious talk about it. Of course, money would be the driving impetus, I'm sure. What do you think about that?
Like I said before, I think sports are it's a test of physical limits almost, where gaming, I don't want to say it's a test of mental limits, but it's more of a test of your ability to like communicate and function as a team and work together. And while the Olympics also does that, there's also that physical aspect to it. So I think it's almost kind of a separate thing. I wouldn't go so far as to say an esport is an actual sport, although it's the same kind of variety of thing. And I think that's a very controversial opinion to have. I know a lot of people would be okay with having esports in the Olympics, but I think we should almost kind of know that our audience is a little bit different than that, and it's hard to appreciate if you haven't played the game, because again, you don't know why it's difficult. Whereas everyone can appreciate a sport in the Olympics because we're familiar with that set of rules and boundaries that, the universe has given us. So it might almost be better to just have kind of like an esports Olympics, which is a totally different thing, but still kind of the same level of seriousness and competitiveness.
Well, Michael, you as you know, we're teaching digital game-based learning. You're talking about being able to communicate, being able to function as a team. Do you find that there are things that are in League of Legends that cross over into the real world? For instance, I watched one of your coaching tutorials, which was really, really well done, where you talked about if you don't know where you are, if you don't know what you're doing. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I believe the direct quote from that video is something along the lines of, if you ever feel lost and don't know what goal you're working towards, then you're doing something wrong. it's kind of like how if you were to show up to work and not have a task in mind and just kind of fill around on your computer, you're not really being productive. You're kind of just letting the game play itself instead of you playing the game. So that kind of definitely applies to other real world situations. I think there's a lot of similar parallels in terms of how you learn and how you communicate that could definitely be applied to, say, like a regular sport. There's definitely been experiences and, you know, certain coaches that come from a sports background to, say, coaching football and become a very successful esports coach because the values and how you convey information are all the same. It's just the medium that you're working with is different.
How does knowing the skill level or backgrounds or uh, expertise of your players or those you're coaching affect how you coach?
Well, I think that the only difference really is like a fundamental baseline of knowledge. There is a ranking system similarly to chess. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Yes.
Like ELO, or we use MMR, which stands for matchmaking rating. But the ELO system itself is still kind of in place in a lot of competitive games where it's kind of a weighted system of if you play against someone who's around the same skill level, you gain a set amount of points. If you play against someone and win against a much better person, you would gain a lot more points. So say like someone would come into the chess scene and be very new and defeat a grandmaster, they would instantly skyrocket to a really, really high level. So it kind of works like that. So when I'm coaching someone, I know what their ranking is inside of a game. At the highest levels, just because someone would be higher ranked than someone else in solo queue, which is our way of like gauging our ranking, where you queue up as one person and to fit into a randomly made team of 5, the more you win, the more points you get, the higher you are. That doesn't always translate to how you work in a team environment. There's a lot of other qualities that make someone good at communicating or working together as a team, or like talking and using that information. So that doesn't necessarily always impact what I say. At times, I'd rather just not know how good someone is and kind of figure it out on my own, just to avoid any bias. I don't want to assume that they know something or that they don't know something and then gloss over it. I think I would just start saying that, assuming that they know nothing, and then as the session goes on, I learn what they know and their baseline of knowledge, and I can work from there. So the first parts of a session is really just me gauging that baseline. And I think like of my standard 1 hour coaching session, I would take like 5 to 10 minutes to figure that out, ask them questions. I do a lot of pausing and asking them, what do you think you should do in this situation? And then why? And that kind of gives me a good idea of like what their level of depth is. If they know to do the right thing but don't understand the reasoning behind it, that also shows like they're not quite at this level yet. They might be down here.
So there might be.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
No. Please.
I was just saying 2 things about your comments are really interesting. One is the whole rating idea of when you play people better than you are, you know, that tends to kind of up your value. I mean, the University of Kentucky just went to something called the Citrus Bowl, which I think is kind of interesting. But them beating Penn State was a big deal because they've never beaten a team in a bowl setting that, you know, with that level of respect and ratings and so forth. So their health went up really, really quickly. So that's interesting to hear that analogy. But I really like your idea of thinking about the students that might be watching this video about how you use games, how you instruct during games, watching what people do and being just as careful about assessing where they're at as a baseline. That's one of the most durable findings in educational research is prior knowledge. Oswald said in 68 or something, you know, if you want to teach people, find out where they're at right now. And so that's really interesting pedagogically. So,
well, I think that even playing a game kind of assumes that you have some level of prior knowledge, right? There's about 120 characters in this game. To play at a competitive level, even at the very lowest levels, it's kind of understood that most people know what most of the characters do and their limits. So if I were to get someone that came in brand new out of the gate, like knowing literally nothing about the game, I'd almost say like, hey, just go play on your own, figure this stuff out to get that baseline level, and then come back to me. It would be kind of a waste of their money to pay me for an hour to teach them like the very basics of the game that they can learn, just playing it themselves. It's kind of like a crash course thing. You just gotta kind of dive in and just see where they're at.
Right. Very good.
Which we're going to have our class do as well. They're going to have virtually no knowledge, and they're just going to jump right into it. And
you might be surprised that some of them have already played before. I think that could be something for sure.
But you said they could play against AIs, right?
Yeah, if they're brand new, they could play together and play against AIs and just try and figure stuff out. At the very beginning, I think it's more important just to kind of pick a character, get familiar with that one character, play it a bunch, and learn kind of its limits and like what you want to be doing in a game with that character, and not kind of try and branch out to overloading your brain with all the 120 or something odd characters in the game and trying to figure everything out. Like, I think just taking a very narrow approach and just focusing on one thing and just learning that one thing will help them a lot.
So now that you've been player and you've been coach, do you have a preference between the two?
I definitely like both situations. The only problem was that I, as a player, was good, but not quite good enough to replace the people on existing pro teams. So my idea at that time was, how do I still involve myself in this scene and be relevant if I'm at this, very, very edge of being pushed into just good enough? Our ranking ladder has like a couple million people on it, I believe. And I managed to get to 0.01% of that ladder. Even at that level, there are still, top 200. This is that's the amount of people that were left, I think. It's top 200 is our highest rank in the game. It's called Challenger. Those people are the ones that are really up for grabs for pro teams and trying to be like competitive at the highest level. I was at that bottom of that top 200. So even though I was at that 200 level and had the same rank as someone who was rank 1, the difference between me and the rank 1 player is just exponentially different. And like, I can identify that I was lacking in a lot of areas, and I wasn't quite up to speed. So I think that's what kind of pushed me to become a player. It was like, well, if I'm not good enough to replace these people, how much effort would it take for me to actually do that? And I was like, I may not ever do that. Even if I dedicate thousands of hours into trying to become better than them, they're also doing the same thing. And I don't know what's limiting me from doing that. It could be reflexes. It could be, just a certain pattern and the way my brain thinks that's hard to break out of that stops me from being at that highest level. So coaching kind of just naturally fit the bill there in terms of I could help the players that were already really, really good that had the things that I didn't have, learn everything else and kind of fill their gaps in their knowledge. So that's a really rewarding feeling when you see that pay off. You spend 2 or 3 years working with one player and he may go from top 2% to top 10 of the game, which is 0.0001%, right? And that in itself is a rewarding feeling, but then seeing that person even go pro, which is what I saw last year after working with some members of my team. They're now moved on to some really, really large organizations that have multi-million-dollar backing and have insanely high salaries, and they can finally go home and say to their parents, like, hey, all those hours of wasting time on video games, I'm making $300,000 a year. Like, what are you going to do about it? So
Michael is like Coach Cal. He's got one and done players where they just rise to the top ranks, and then they're well in demand. And players can make a lot of money. There was a player called Universe.
Mm.
Michael, you familiar with him or her?
Yeah.
And at the age of 27, won like $2.8 million playing 67 tournaments.
So I can't say exactly who because I would be breaking some NDAs, but I know a player on a certain team that makes well over $2 million a year in salary, not including any of their sponsorships for external gear or, ads, tournament winnings, anything. Just $2 million flatline salary. There's a player known by Faker who is arguably the best player in the world for 5 or 6 years, something like that. He won, I think, 2 or 3 world champions, 1 or 2, I don't remember. But his net worth is something insane. I know he makes over like $3 to $4 million a year, just playing the game, doing almost nothing else. He doesn't have to do anything besides just play on that team, and I think his notoriety in itself is what they're willing to pay for. People have huge fan bases, in the millions of people, and those fan bases carry a lot of weight in terms of they'll buy merch from the store of the team that they like. They'll buy jerseys, they'll buy, even chairs with like their name on it, or backpacks or whatever. They'll pay for posters to be signed and shipped to them. So I think that, that's a huge thing, and it's kind of a market that's been relatively untapped into by a lot of people.
That's what I find, and I'm so happy that you, number one, that Mark knew you, but also that you were willing to sort of, quote, virtually guest speak in our class, because I've been doing some reading. I was on sabbatical last summer, and last semester, and I've been doing some reading about competitive gaming, and I'm not a youngster, so I try and keep up with things, but, I just feel like there's this whole economy out there that people are obviously making money at, and, people who are highly entrepreneurial and in these sort of digital spaces, and, Silicon Valley and all this kind of stuff. But I think, the general person, certainly most educators, I have to say my experience in public schools or any formal school setting, doesn't have to be public, and be private, whatever, formal educational settings, is a lot of resistance to gaming. Kids are just wasting their time. Like you were saying about their parents are kind of living in dread fear, that they're not going to go off, to become a dentist or an economist. But I think there's this entire robust economy that is developing around this, just as they do around non-digital or esports. And so one of the things, my goals in class, and that Mark and I talked about, is sort of pulling the curtain back on this, so that, that's all people talk about now, which I don't agree with, that you get an education to get a job. I think you should be well educated and be happy, but go figure, that's just me. But this idea that there is real money in this in multiple arenas, whether it is, playing, coaching, managing sports teams, managing commercialization of brands, celebrity, retail, digital retail. This is a big deal. I'm really glad you're speaking about that.
It's definitely not a common thing to succeed in, though. I think that even though you can pull it off and people do it, that's definitely a 1 in 100,000 kind of deal.
Well, I think being the stars are a little bit like being Michael Jordan or LeBron James. Everybody knows that can't be LeBron James, but they still love watching him, buying the stuff. It has that same sort of economic space in terms of just producing goods and services and those kind of things. So I just think people are really unaware of this whole space. Anyway,
I agree.
I take your point. I'm quite sure if somebody gets to the 0.0001, that's a pretty slim margin.
Like even being at 0.01, I was not good enough to play. And you think about how many people there are. That's an absolutely insane number of people that try and fail. There's definitely a lot of stories I've read online of people like quitting school and jobs to focus on a game for a year or 2 years, and they don't really get anywhere with it. I think that it's only something you should do if you kind of do it in your spare time and you're already at a really high level. And you're saying, well, if I didn't have to worry about this thing, maybe I could push myself to be a little bit better, and that's good enough to be pro. But if you're sitting in the 20th percentile or the 10th percentile, that's still not anywhere close to being good enough. You may be good by, comparison to most people and averages, but in terms of being good enough to play professionally, it's very, very hard. And there's other ways to make money by not playing professionally, like streaming, which is basically just broadcasting to an online site, and people watch you, you make ad revenue, people donate. I do that myself on top of coaching and it's a lot of fun, but I worry for how sustainable it is. You know, like if this game perhaps doesn't really last that long, like 5 to 10 more years, and it goes somewhere else, what do all the people do that this has been their career? And all of a sudden the game that they were playing that gave them notoriety fades away. So it's just, there is kind of like a risk reward. You might get that fame and spotlight for a bit, and then it could all be taken away in the next day. You really have no idea.
I'd like to also mention that Michael is studying biomedical engineering, just in case you think he's sitting in the basement eating bonbons all day. But,
playing his cello back there, I see.
Yes.
Yeah, he's musical beyond belief. He's, whatever he does, he's incredible.
That's wonderful.
I can brag on him all day. And I often do. So, Dr. Mazur and
Any other final thing? Oh, go ahead.
No, well, I was going to say, Dr. Mazur and I really wanted to thank you for your time and for letting us, speak with you. And I really want to encourage our class to follow Supernova. And I was hoping you can tell them how they can do that, and maybe when your next game might be that they can listen to it on Twitch.
The best way to do that would be to follow the Twitter, which is super_nova_inc. They post notifications for whenever we have games, and they have links to how to get apparel and everything.
Good.
Yeah.
That's on Twitch.
That's Twitter.
Twitter.
The Twitch streams are people from other places and other companies will play in their tournaments, and those channels will stream. So it's not always broadcast under the same name. But the Twitter will tweet out when games are happening pretty consistently.
Good. We'll post that, and they can get on. Mm-hmm. Well, this has been really wonderful, and we so appreciate you doing this. This unfortunately, we have no budget for guest speakers, so we really appreciate you giving us some of your valuable time.
No problem. I think
have told them we're not paying.
Oh, you haven't? Oh,
it's cool to be able to share this with people that really don't have a whole lot of inside knowledge on the scene and like what we do. It's really hard for me to describe to someone what I do for a living, and I think that getting to be able to describe it easier and having more people understand what it is, I can just say, oh, I stream and coach this game, and people will be like, oh, okay. But now you kind of say that, and it's like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Why are you doing that? So it's kind of cool to just be able to broaden people's horizons and get them to see like this other side of something they've never seen before. I like doing that in my own life and just seeing what's out there. It's kind of interesting just to see that there's this whole thing that I never knew existed that's a thriving almost ecosystem.
Well said. I don't think we can end class speakers any better than that. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And it's nice to meet you, Michael. I know you know Mark very well.
Thanks, Michael. Where's my merch?
I'll talk to Supernova and see if they can set you up with something. All right. Thank you, guys.
Have a good night.
Thank you so much, and thanks for helping us with recording.
No problem.